But others, those who had the chance of staying, were coming back, and then some among them, like Catherine himself and his wife, they could easily stay on in America, but then they decided. Mulțumesc frumos, mulțumesc, mulțumesc. Foarte bună, perfecțiune. I can have a large glass of mineral water, which is with gas. Okay?
Good, yes.
I think this one is better than.
Thank you.
This is the European Union.
Yeah.
I say fuck the European Union every time I open I use it.
Why do they do that?
Because they said that this is a way of making sure that the guys are not, ruining the environment. They are not throwing away the caps. And you see what it takes. You have a bureaucracy. Some idiot comes up with such an idea. Everybody else says, "Oh, what a great idea."
Terrible.
That's it. I find it absolutely. I'm all for institutions and everything like this. And this explains part of the attitude against the European Union that all kinds of people in the West have, and here too. Okay. Here, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, this is edition number 104 of Ideas in the Agora. I'm delighted actually to host tonight a friend with a very complex biography already. He emerged from Argentina, one of the countries I dream of from time to time, especially thanks to Borges, but as Telio Lambro reminded me, also of Astor Piazzolla and other people like that. He knows about rugby, which of course I don't know, but even for that, Argentina deserves our respect. There is a story actually of Jewish emigres from Bessarabia who reached Argentina and became gauchos, and are also running networks of prostitution and smuggling and things like that in the good old days of the interwar period. So things happen in Argentina. But then he decided after studying there first to move on, and he studied various things in the humanities in Britain, the United States. And he is now, as you know from the presentation, a professor in the United States. But he's fortunately, a frequent visitor to Italy, where he basically has a kind of second home. And I hope he will keep it for a long time for him to come more often to Romania. And several years ago, I was reading about a new novel which had started with the pretext of the killing of Ioan Petru Culianu, had been published in 2020 in Spanish, La Migración. And then it was translated into Italian in 2022. And I was lucky enough to read that novel and like it immediately. And I will expand on that a little bit later. I knew that Culianu was a character in works of fiction. That already from the most famous book about Culianu, written by Ted Anton, already in that book, well, how shall I put it? There was a lot of fiction because some of the things that Ted Anton was trying to reconstruct, especially those related to the killing, death, the tragic death of Ioan Petru Culianu, and some of the elements of the context of that tragic event were the result of a kind of fictional invention, right? You couldn't rely on documents, you had to use your fantasy more than in a normal historical reconstruction. The thing is, there is a second wave or a second degree form of fictionalization of Culianu's life in the books of other people who have read Ted Danton, by the way, and were impressed, inspired, and they, in turn, so it's a kind of second degree, once again, fiction, form of fiction writing. Then there are those who have just heard about this story, have read a little bit about that somewhere in the academic or para-academic publications. This was the case of Ted Danton himself, right? This is how he discovered there was such a thing as Ioan Petru Culianu. He had no idea this guy had ever existed. And so this was the beginning, already in the 90s, of a series of publications, sometimes short fictions, sometimes even full novels, in several countries. The first, one of the first, was published in 2001 in Spanish too, La Fiesta de las Turcas, which I have here, 2001, by José Antonio Aguilar Rivera, who, as in another fictional game or postmodernist rewriting of things that have been written by others, he is using the names of characters, the fictitious names of fictitious characters as invented by Saul Bellow in the passages in Ravelstein, his novel, where he is talking about Eliade, Mircea Eliade, whom he hated absolutely after socializing with him and being friends with him and so forth. He hated Eliade probably because his wife at the time was Romanian, and then when she fell out of grace, then he developed an absolutely intense hatred of everything Romanian, and Eliade was a side effect of that. I mean, a collateral victim of that. Somebody whom I met at a Liberty Fund conference in the United States and later in Europe and in other places was coming from Mexico and told me, when in coffee breaks we were discussing things about authors that are not on the reading list of that conference, that, yeah, there is such a thing. And I read it, noticing already that there is a kind of third degree fiction in which already the fictitious names of fictitious characters are being played upon once more with a second, third degree of distanciation. First of all, Bellow had chosen absolutely bizarre Romanian names. Eliade is Grielescu and things of this sort. Very bizarre names do not sound Romanian anyway, until, or can sound Romanian too. But the list is very long. There is a novel in Italian, Il Presagio, by, it's called Un Thriller Esoterico by Claudio Gatti, which was published in Italy again in 1996, and with Rizzoli, with a major Italian publisher, not marginal, and then was published in Romanian as well as translated in 2005. There's a journalist who, kind of delirious, I have to say. It focuses on the killing and anyway. The Presagio is a dream the fictional Culianu has about his being beheaded by a ventilator just the night before his actual killing. In 1999, I received from Andrei Codescu Messiah, his novel with Simon and Schuster, in which there is a small passage which is kind of cryptic and, in which the two characters are there. In 2000, came out Solberg Rebelstein. But I had the privilege of reading the manuscript from a common friend, Richard Stern, was a professor of English literature and a great essayist and novelist, forgotten, unfortunately, in the United States, who showed me the manuscript. And the manuscript was absolutely scandalous in the sense that Bellow was accusing, as in the published novel, but with a lot more force, more details, kind of disgusting novel, presenting Grielescu Eliade as himself a killer of Jews in the pogrom of Bucharest and so forth back then. I wouldn't have been so keen on this, but this was taken up by the reviewers of the novel as a fact. These people thought simplistically, idiotically, that this was a way of fiction to fictionalize something that had actually happened. And thus they retained the truth, the historical fact, disentangling the historical fact from its fictional garments, and then focusing on the fact that, yes, indeed, he had been a killer. Just an example of fictions in the... And the references to the killing of Culianu are really sick, I have to say. I mean, really, he could have... Anyway, but requiescat in pace, of course. Then again, I mentioned this, the names and all that in Fiesta de las Turcas. In 2009, I jump over other examples. Norman Mania, who did this in several of his writings, there are characters that are inspired by Eliade. In 2009, Vizuina, Cosmin Dima, Eliade, and Mihnea Palade, Culianu. Now, these names are sound Romanian, at least that is granted. Then Caius Dobrescu, in one of his novels, Minoic, there is a passage of Tidid or Titi Diomed Karayani and Dinu Dima was Culianu. But everything is a parodic fantasy, if I can use this category to more or less. Then Ruxandra Ceseranu in Un Singur Cer Deasupra Lor, which is a kind of fantasy inspired by Romanian recent history. There's a chapter which is called Petru, in which Ioan Petru Culianu is there. Helian Eliade, Petru Vlaia is Culianu, then the killer has a name as well. There's another novel by Laurențiu Orășanu, who died a few years ago, Migranții, and that is based on a rather painstaking reconstruction, documentation, and this is something that I saluted at the time. I think he did a rather good job in order to somehow reconstruct this historical milieu and so forth. But then came this novel. This novel is, to me, the best ever inspired by the tragic events of Culianu's life and death. And the closest, I think, to Culianu's fiction and scholarship themselves. Because Culianu was fictionalizing himself to begin with, right? And from the very beginning, in his early short fictions, you already have a kind of premonitory, prophetic, sometimes parodic, sometimes esoteric, sometimes historically based, sometimes delirious, sometimes. So you find he was working on it quite systematic, not systematically, but constantly. And in his first short stories, which were to be published in 71, but then they were canceled by censorship, that he emigrated. Things became impossible. Later collected in the volume Arta Fuji, then in other writings such as Tos Grek, major writing posthumously published, Hesperus, which is a kind of esoteric science fiction, Jocul de Smarald, which is not far from there in the spirit, Pergamento de Afan, but also in his scholarly writings. And I would mention just two, Psychanodia, the Voyages of the, then Out of This World, which was also translated, as you know, in Romanian with a very solid critical apparatus by the Oișteanu, the late Mrs. Oișteanu, and still present Mr. Oișteanu, Andrei Oișteanu. And the second edition of the Italian translation was just published. I received in Italy right now. I was told so by Luca Siniscalco, who is connected to Bietti and to this, who was connected to the making of this fantastic tribute volume for Culianu in 2021. I'm saying all this because, of course, in various circles around the world, somehow this originally an urban legend evolved into a kind of myth. It is not just a cultural myth in Romania, but it has a kind of mythical presence beyond, the scandalous, beyond the tragic, beyond the kind of mythical kind of insertion in a number of literary cultural circles around the world. Italy is the best example, I think, more than Romania. The presence of Culianu, if you were to, to try and map his post-mortem presence, his afterlives, if we are looking for them, they are not necessarily in our land, Dracula's land, where being undead is a normal patriotic condition, but we are not immortal, we are undead. So this is the ideal in a country like this. But in Italy, where there is, people are writing scholarly about this, are inspired to write fictions, are still translating and republishing books. So this is pretty much the fresco. We are surrounded by frescoes. I felt like doing one here. Now, I don't want to say anything about the secondary literature based on Culianu, because that is another story. In which most news are not great. But still, there is a certain... and then there remained the killing of Culianu that also, I think, enhanced this mythological cultural presence and turned it into a tabloid must. Everybody who is anybody in the press in Romania has tried their hand at writing something about that. Of course, we still don't know most of the things that we would like to know about the killing. So I was struck by the reading of this book, which we now have in Romanian, Transmigrație, because it was written by somebody who obviously had read other books before, not only Culianu's books. And was somehow rewriting it and connecting it to what? To Argentina. And that was a bonus I had. With this image of the Argentinian, Bohemian, I can say maybe Bohemian Rhapsody, if I can. In the 90s, a world which, of course, Borges, my ideal writer, could not possibly describe. Maybe he could. So this is my, I was struck by, again, by somebody who was obviously in sync with what exactly, transtemporally, but in sync with what Culianu was writing about in his scholarly works. And then, of course, in the same, very closely connected to the fiction that Culianu was, and this was this mysterious guy. Now he's here. How did it started?
Let me go back in time, and because everything has a precedent, every effect has a cause. I had a very early fascination with Romania that might have probably started with Dracula. Let's be honest. When I was a child,
Our national hero. Yeah.
I think Bram Stoker's did wonders, PR wonders. But early on in my university career, I decided to take a course, a Romanian language course at the University of Buenos Aires. I did one semester only because then the course was discontinued because there weren't enough people. It was only 3 of us. It was such a small class that the Romanian ambassador invited us over to his house for tea. And I didn't learn very much. I remember very little, but this was a very important chapter in the history of my relationship with Romania, and I still had never been to the country. When I took a job at the University of Chicago, came this third major chapter, which was my discovery of the Culianu story, which was by accident, absolutely. I had been working at the University of Chicago for a year. I went to the divinity school every morning for coffee because one of the few coffees on campus is in the divinity school downstairs. And I had no idea. And one day I was in a used bookstore in my neighborhood, which, an aside, when I moved to Chicago, there were 6 used bookstores in my neighborhood. And when I left, there were only 2, and now there's probably none. But I was in this used bookstore, just going through, just browsing, and the book stood out for me. It kind of manifested itself. I know it sounds like magical realism, but it really did call me up. It was a purple book, and it was Ted Anton's book. And I read the back, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. This Romanian professor assassinated at the University of Chicago, where I worked, in the divinity school where I went every day. I couldn't believe that there was nothing on campus that remembered this event, which, by the way, is the only political assassination ever to take place on a US university campus. So I started, of course, I read the book and I started asking around some older professors, and of course they remembered this, but they weren't very keen on talking about this. I started reading Culianu, his own work, his fiction, his essays, and in the year 2016, which was the 25th anniversary of the assassination, I organized an event. I wanted to have it in the divinity school, but they wouldn't let me. Culianu still has enemies, believe it or not, at the University of Chicago.
We believe it.
I made flyers, posters, and I would put them up in the morning at the divinity school, and when I went in the afternoon, they were gone. And I also know for a fact that one of the faculty members there was very annoyed by this event that we were organizing. But I did organize it, and I invited Ted Anton, who also works in Chicago in a different university, and he agreed to come. And I had also an ex-student of Culianu, his name is Gregory Spinner. He came from New York. And the third speaker was another young faculty member there. His name is William Mazzarella, who studies the thought of Culianu. He's an anthropologist interested in issues like the phenomenon of charisma, and he was very interested in Culianu. So it was actually a very well attended event. We had a full house, and a lot of older faculty members came, and they all shared the feeling that it was extremely unfair that the university had done so many things in order to forget the history of Culianu. That same year, the then president of the University of Chicago published a book, big, massive history of the University of Chicago. And I received it. If I didn't buy it, most faculty members received a copy as a present, and I immediately went to the index to see how many times the name Culianu appeared.
About 0 times.
About 0 times, 0 times. So it wasn't not even a chapter, not even a mention, nothing. This was damnatio memoriae in its purest form, a real form, nothing like this so-called cancel culture today. This is real cancellation, complete forgetfulness, and young people at the University of Chicago really have no idea who Culianu was, that he was killed in the bathroom of the 3rd floor, etc. So all of these things, I'm not trying to say that. Why? The answer is very banal. It has to do with money and with publicity. It's really bad publicity for the university. And they wouldn't even allow the TV when the murder happened to be on campus. So I don't think there's anything really sinister behind it. It's just really bad publicity. And it happened at a time when the University of Chicago was always an elite school, but it was also always a very self-selecting, kind of strange, eccentric school.
Yes.
So not for everybody. The overachieving student would go to Yale, Princeton, Harvard. And at that time, in the late 80s and early 90s, Chicago starts a very aggressive move to becoming on par with those universities in terms of reputation.
And this means fundraising. First of all, this means fundraising. So no stain on the coat of arms. Everything has to be deleted. We were there with Mona April 1992. And of course, it was less than a year, right? It was first part of April 92. And I was giving a lecture and so forth, staying there at, the faculty club there where Eliade used to go in there. Went into the divinity school, of course. There was absolutely no sense that there was just one mistake in this fantastic bookstore, underground bookstore there, which is probably the most fascinating bookstore I have ever seen in my life. I wonder whether it is still there. Anyhow,
it moved.
I heard at some point it still exists, but it moved. Yeah. But anyhow, there it was a kind of labyrinth, a fantastic labyrinth of books. But then, once you're going down the steps into this underground, there was a book by Culianu there, forgotten or put by someone as a kind of tribute. It was, of course, out of this world. And maybe somebody had, but other than that, everything has been totally deleted, and there was no sense of anything. Yeah. And besides, just a little bit, when I tried to do these 2 massive volumes in memory of Culianu, which were published in 2001 by Nemira, with Nemira. Of course, I started in 99. I was in the States at the time at Stanford. I was trying to get people to contribute, you see. And I have to say, the list of the contributors to that includes some of his former students, many of his former colleagues, but they accepted knowing that, it will happen in Romania, it will be in foreign languages, but it doesn't really matter that much, and so forth. And only those who really wanted to be a part of that participated, They didn't have to. There was no obligation. But I had a long correspondence with people, for instance, some who couldn't write something specific for that tribute, but offered one of their papers on other topics, you see, which is also feasible. In a Festschrift or Denkschrift, you can include texts on another topic. Bruce Lincoln, for instance, at the time gave me a text which had nothing to do with Culianu's work, but had to do with his as a tribute. We discussed this from 97 I started, and 99, 2000, and the 2001 was. But obviously the rule of silence was there, the law of silence. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to say there's also the reason that it's not just money, right? Many of his colleagues disliked him, and even to 25 years later, they tried to, I wouldn't say actively boycott, but they weren't cooperative with me and with the organization of this event. I think his students loved him very much, and many of his colleagues really hated him. But what I was trying to say is that in no way my novel was sort of an attempt to undo this wrong, because I don't think literature can do anything in the world or save anybody or change anything. But it was Culianu was simply an inspiration, and not just his own work, sort of in the border between fiction and scholarship, which I was also starting to inhabit that border, and now I'm a lot more on the side of just fiction and writing very little of academic work anymore, but also in his personality and in all of the different worlds that he invoked and brought together in his thought. So he was, in a way, a muse, I would say. And that's why it felt right to begin the book with Culianu. So the story of Culianu is a very important part of the book, but it's not the only part of the book. There's a whole other dimension that is a lot more Argentine than Romanian and Chicagoan. So he was mostly a source of inspiration. And again, the circumstances of his death just so humiliating on top of cruel, were so grotesque too, were a source of inspiration for this novel, which is not my first novel, but it is the first novel that I published.
What is spectacular in terms of the structure of this novel is that there are two people who die. Well, one of the threads of this book is, of course, transmigration of the souls, right? It's spiritual journeys and transmigration, reincarnations and all that. But they are not, from my viewpoint, they are precious in the sense that they revisit the traditions related to transmigration in a rather loose way. There is no, how shall I say, fixation on any of the traditions. So you don't need to look for, let's say, any of the options open when you start talking about reincarnation. So it's a kind of, again, it's a ludibrium. Again, it's a joke. It's a combination of things, a fluid combination otherwise, interactive fluid. And there are all the theories and creeds and theologies and metaphysics that have been connected to various theorizations or conceptualizations of migration, of transmigration, metempsychosis, and things like that. All of them are taken very liberally and not literally, and they are, how shall I say, melting into one another and talking to one another. And this is something that I particularly liked. It's a kind of revisitation of all kinds of forms of lore about transmigration without any of, because once you decide, to follow one of these things, then you get into the closeness of that system. You have to say, what happened to, in the terms of Culianu's mind games theory, then you have to start choosing, no? Is this or is it this or that? Body, soul, where the spirit is in all this? What kind of, what about corporality? How physical is it? Then all that. And unfortunately, this is not. And I think in order to deal with that, we had to come up with these new concepts, which are entirely yours, like the one that I mentioned earlier today at the book launch at the book fair, which is just changing a prefix, but changes the whole thing of incandescence. We know excadences is something else, yeah, in which he is developing this theory. And the second thing I want to mention is that in this kind of game, open-ended game of reincarnations, the second and ultimately the central character, if we want to think of one particular character, is someone, you will have to read the novel. I will not disclose any of the facts and the intrigue and the plot and everything. That's for you to read. But there is a guy who, an Argentinian, a young Argentinian who disappears, and he somehow communicates with us through a diary that is lost, found mysteriously, enigmatically, dubiously, and so forth. So you have two actually series of reincarnations, of migrations, but they are connected. And that's the interesting part of it. And then this second part is, of course, a lot about a kind of Argentinian background. And this is where I said I discovered things that I didn't know from Borges, which is my Bible in terms of where, and also Bioy Casares, I have to be, to agree on that. And that is fantastic. That is really extraordinary. And then once you start this cycle of reincarnations in which you have people such as Bruno, and if you have Culianu, Giordano Bruno is an inevitable part of this kind of transmission. But then you have Miron Costin. And Miron Costin transmigrating, being transfigured into something that I wish we had, you see, in the history of our culture. But it is a meticulous rendering of something that could have been. And this is where his scholarship comes in, because you recognize things that are not only plausible, but quite credible and quite in keeping with the rest. So that Miron Costin, from the moment I read this novel, became my ideal Miron Costin. Well, the poor thing, he died tragically himself. So, and by the way, by mistake, actually, I mean, it was a killing that was not necessary. It was a rumor that somehow he had done this and that. And Cantemir's father was, of course, illiterate and had been a former mercenary and quick when it came to cutting heads and so forth, dispatched a gang of guys. Then the guy was killed. Then it turned out, actually, well, that is too bad. So it was a kind of a side effect of confusion. So it was not a glorious death. It didn't change anything. It had absolutely no meaning in history. A kind of the death of somebody who was so important had absolutely no meaning at all. Well, we don't get this story from Dimitri Cantemir, who is idolizing his father, and of course we cannot never find this out. But we know from history there are other people around. Yeah. Did you? I'm familiar with the reception of the book in Italy. Horia Cornelucci Cortaș, various Italian friends there who are Eliade and Culianu fans, keep me informed, and so I knew as it happened. Maybe I shouldn't disclose that, but I received a PDF of the book because that travels faster than the physical book and so forth. And anyway, and it's a beautiful title in Italian too, which is Borgesian, of course. The time is a river. Tempo fiume, that's the two characters, the ideas which are pre-Socratic, whatever you want, old philosophy from the pre-Socratics down. And I think it squares with what you say, because there is this, how shall I say, ahistorical temporality which flows like a river. It flows in every direction, up and down. It's a river that can go upstream too, can return upstream. And I like that.
Yeah, the title was, Italians really like to change titles.
Yeah.
Films, books, sometimes the translated versions are just preposterous.
Yeah.
In this case, it was a nice version. I mean, of course, I still
Il
prefer.
tempo è un fiume is also sounds nicely and is a very evocative title.
But the logic behind this was that since I was an unknown author in Italy, but I was from Argentina, and Borges is so venerated in Italy, they wanted to associate me, to remind people that Argentina, Borges.
I can think of worse associations.
So they even added an epigraph with the line from the Borges poem that was not in the original book, of course. But I mean, it's fine.
It squares. It's fine.
I am a reader of Borges, of course, so I wasn't offended by this. It found very good readers in Italy. It wasn't.
Yes, I read exceptional book reviews and in prominent periodicals, and that I liked very much.
Yes, the original in Spanish came out at a bad time because it came out in May of 2020.
Yeah.
So that was a very bad time for a book to come out, even though people were at home reading. There was no chance to really promote or present or anything, or for me to go to Buenos Aires. But an important moment in the writing of the book was my first trip to Romania in 2015 when I first came to Bucharest. On my honeymoon, actually.
I was struck when he told me this 2 years ago. I said, "Well, here is a nice guy were in Iași, passing by in the street where Culianu lived. The Culianu house used to stand." And well, I was taken aback, and I said, "Well, he's a nice guy. He seems smart. He's very smart. I read him." Honeymoon in Romania.
My wife was actually delighted because she has partly of Romanian descent, but and she had never been to Romania. But still, to make it a little bit more like a honeymoon, we also went to Greece after.
Yeah. Oh, okay. That's better. That's better.
But that first trip to Bucharest was.
You did what Romanians do, so they go to Greece.
They go right. It was Romanian all around.
Exactly.
Yes. But just being in Bucharest for the first time, after having read so much about the country and the city, and having tried to study the language, was what really gave me a sort of a physical grounding to begin to imagine the place. Not that I think that a writer has to have actually done the things that they write about. But it's true that a close encounter, a first-hand encounter with a place gives you some sort of grounding for it. And then Bucharest is hardly mentioned in the novel. Only there's a moment when I talk a little bit about how Culianu spent his student years here, but very, very little. So it wasn't really a description of Bucharest that mattered, but just a first encounter with Romania, and that's soon after I started writing the book, and then it took a long time.
Now, you can still learn Romanian; it will be easy for you.
Yes.
You can already read. So this, because he is a polyglot, this man here, and I think he comes from a tradition, a family tradition of polyglots. His mother, I disclose this, is a linguist. These are people who did not discover culture, you say, and they are in the sphere of the humanities, what used to be the sphere of humanities. We make sad jokes about that, but anyhow, so yeah, with your Italian, with your Spanish, with your Latin, with your French, which is excellent, and so forth. We switch languages when we talk, and then just today, I think it came to we just happened to somebody who was speaking French, and we spoke French. Yeah, so there was a feeling of, how shall I say, of closeness and the familiarity also on the basis of that, I think. He came up with the quite, how shall I say, pressing questions on Zabaidoc. He had heard about that. Then I had to do, for him, a kind of history of what Zabaidoc means, which is probably not clear to the most Romanians either, you see, which is, I think, a way of transfiguration of the Balkan nature of Romania, which was to be met only in high-level abstract poetry, such as Ion Barbu, wherein Crai de Curteveche in Matei Caragiale. So, in other words, it was a way, I mean, being a fan of Zavaidoc, coming from the cultivated elites in interior Romania, meant was a temptation of self-orientalizing and self-exoticizing oneself in order to come into something that Zavaidoc, of course, was not aware of, but he was doing it. He didn't have to have a secondary discourse about that because he was living it, he was doing it. He was syncretic in every possible respect. Tango was also on the menu at the time, you know, as tango was actually a rather blooming kind of music in interwar Romania, especially in the 1930s, coming all the way from various places. Paris was, of course, one of them, Vienna, Berlin, other destinations. So there was a moment of a fusion of all these musics, Oriental, folk, which means basically what? Court music, desecrated as it were, and you know, degraded up by the peasants and so forth, turned into some form of fun. Culianu was coming from that kind of culture that had to deal with it, like Eliade before him. Eliade had to deal with this specificity of the place, which needed to be supplemented. You know, this deficit of modernization and this civilizational deficit, as perceived by everybody, including Romanians themselves who are educated, but obvious to the foreign observers and travelers and everything, had to be overcompensated with something. And one of the possibilities was to invent cosmic Christianity, as we were saying. We did it first. It's a nice try with what you say, Jesus and all these other guys. Very nice, interesting, fun. But we were there first, which is to this day a fixation here in the. But then in the novel, you get into, so this manuscript, this lost manuscript is found and is read loud. So we go back to the origins of reading, originally up until very late.
Pre-Ambrosian.
Exactly. The pre-Ambrosian time when you could only read standing and reading loud, in a loud voice. It was not thinkable that someone could sit and read to themselves, even mumbling. And they are reading this thing while moving from bar to bar to restaurant to bar, one long night in Buenos Aires. So we get a feeling of Buenos Aires by night in bars and restaurants. And in conversations between these people who come from several walks of life, not just from one milieu, and then also have, and somehow they manage to come up with collectively with a kind of understanding of what the absence of Aaron, the second hero, or maybe the main hero, his absence, what that means for them, how this connects to the other forms of absence and of transmigration. That struck me, I have to once again to say. Now, in the book throughout, and that was something that I particularly liked, as I indicated, there is a recursive presence of things that one finds in Culianu's work. So you bump into them from time to time. Culianu has a continuous presence there. So those who remember, still remember the first pages of the book, while reading through, they somehow are accompanied by this presence, which I found very, very evocative, very strong. And it has, because otherwise the enigmas of Aaron's disappearance and manuscript and tribulations would be trivial, sad, tragic, because the person disappeared, but otherwise devoid of that kind of high spiritual level, which is announced already in the, from the first line, with the prescient word, as kind of prophetic, prophetic or self-fulfilling prophetic line. They are about to kill me. First, there was some more. This is the first line. What was the reception in Spanish-speaking countries?
It was actually small. It found very good readers, again, like in Italy, but not a lot of readers. And one of the things I should say is that, and I'm sure you know this, Argentina's history is marked in the past 50 years by the events of the 1970s, the military dictatorship that ruled the country between 1976 and 1983. It was the biggest horror of our 20th century, and of course, in comparison with the horrors of Europe in the 20th century, is very small, and if you can compare horrors. But it's still very, very present in the minds and in the sensibilities of people. And I was born during this time, And of course, the haunting figure there is the figure of the desaparecido,
Yes.
the disappeared. There are still thousands of people whose bodies were never found. So it wasn't just the killing of people; it was the going back to this total cancellation of a human being, the elimination of the body, which is one of the most atrocious things that you can think of for the family,
Yes.
right? So, one thing is to be able to mourn a person at a space, to know that remains are somewhere, and that's why human beings have been burying their loved ones for probably hundreds of thousands of years. Another thing is to be pretty much sure that they're dead, but not know and not have ever had access to a body. So in a way, Argentine literature, Argentine cinema, theater have been completely fixated with this history, and it's also a little suffocating too.
Yes.
It's always also done in ways that I am not a very big fan of. This is sort of the lamentation side
Yeah,
of
yeah,
this.
yeah. I am struck by this. One of the things that I discuss in my circle of theorists of history is the omnipresent, the absolutely obsessive, omnipresent discussion of the desaparecidos. Every time we meet somewhere, there is a rather strong contingent of theorists of history from Latin America, both in Argentina and in Brazil. Yeah, they are absolutely fixated on this, and they come up with theories of history and memory, of course, because now, as theories of history are not possible anymore, since the grand narratives of history have been totally deconstructed. There's no way one can come up with a theory of history. There are, as a kind of ersatz, the theories of memory, in which, because this is a way which has affected people that you know yourself and people that can be identified, is rather than a theoretical discussion of whatever causation, this and that, okay, meaning, whatnot, metaphysics, whatever. So it's a very concrete example of reflection on memory as opposed to history. And this is something indeed at some point rather blocking the way of a kind of, mémoire apaisée, as Paul Ricard used to say. Now, coming to terms with it, letting the past have a certain sense of closure, moving on, and understanding what had happened.
And again, not an attempt. I didn't try to do this, but I realized soon that I was centering the novel around the figure of a person who disappears, but removing that completely from the context of the 1970s.
Yes.
So the thinking about disappearance, but outside of that context that has already been so explored and looked over and abused, really.
Yes, absolutely.
Abused, and become a commonplace to the point that that people are desensitized.
Yes.
To it. When I do think that the phenomenon of the desaparecido is very, very haunting, very atrocious, of course, and so very fascinating for a writer.
Yes. Do you imagine such a work in English translation having a global readership?
Part of me thinks it's not a work that could have a very wide readership. I mean, it makes sense that it comes out in Romanian because of its topic. It made sense that it came out in Italian because there's also a there's a kinship, there's a similar sensibility.
And the presence of a living memory of Culianu in Italy, which makes sense. Now, if this the novel I mentioned in by Gatti, this the from '96. This was calling itself on thriller esoterico. So he was announcing the colors, right? Your book was presented as a giallo, as a roman policier, as a thriller.
Well, that was a terrible strategy.
I saw this giallo. I've seen giallo before, but I don't think anyway.
The publishing house, again, trying to. You should know that in Italy, there are about 900 new titles edited every month, and about 50% of these books don't sell 10 copies.
Yes.
There's an overabundance of books that nobody reads. So in order to guarantee at least a few sales, the editor decided to, first of all, give it the Borgesian title.
Yeah.
Second of all, to market it as a giallo, as a detective novel, basically, which is not. But they decided to go ahead and do this. And this is a terrible mistake, because the reader of giallo, the reader of detective novels, is a very particular reader. It's a very demanding reader. It's a very faithful reader, and it's a very good reader, in my opinion.
Yes.
And they like what they like, and they know a good giallo when they see one.
Of course. Well, otherwise they throw it away because.
So they open this book and they're like, "What the hell is this?"
Yes.
And then there's the reader who despises the giallo, so because the giallo is a genre, so it's a lower genre. It's and they know this is a giallo, so they will never pick it up because it's a giallo, but then it's not a giallo. So I thought that was a terrible strategy, but
they still read, which is something. They do not sell too many copies, but as they have so many titles, somebody gets a book to read anyway. So otherwise, it's a huge effort to put all these books on the table. Just in the, I had to talk about books that were written as a giallo in order to be sold. And I had to make comments or to participate in book launches in Naples and so forth about that, you see. But this was, how shall I say, it was fair enough, because this was a book, for instance, by a young gypsy girl who is, or Roma girl who is in Italy, coming from Romania, blah, 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 written by a not so great American woman novelist. But since this was about Naples as seen by foreigners, this was included in a series of books edited by my close friend Adriana Corrado. So I had to comment on that. I made pretty nasty comments, but the idea was that being a giallo, otherwise, I mean, the guys would not be interested in a novel about immigration. They would just throw it away. So they turned it into a thriller in order to maybe excite the curiosity of 5 minutes, kind of curiosity of that. One thing that is about Italy is that you spend a lot of time in Italy. You found a kind of third country there, or maybe second in order of preferences, right?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time. I lived there for the first time in 2005. I lived in Rome for a year, and it was always, I felt Italy as a home from very early on. And I'm an Italian citizen as well through my mother's family. So in 2018, I started spending a significant amount of time, and my university sends me there half of the year to teach there. We have a center there. So I spent half of the year in Florence.
This is the only recipe that some non-Americans have invented, which is to be a professor in America but never staying the full. From our country, the champion of this game was the late Mihai Sparioso, a very close friend, a comparative literature scholar, who managed to be always somewhere else, while of course, being paid rather nicely by an American university. But the trouble is that even that is a fragile, it's a word of warning for you. For instance, we're trying to set up an Institute of Intercultural Studies in Avignon, where his university was having a campus. To my absolute amazement, it was not popular because the students didn't like Avignon, didn't like the food in Avignon, I didn't like the place in general. And they had gone to extreme lengths to restore, renovate some medieval buildings, turn them into a high-tech dorm for it was perfect all around Avignon, and they hated it. So they had to close it down for lack of interest in that. While in Pisa, have you been to the Villa di Corliano?
No,
Go.
never.
Because that would be a place where I think I can easily imagine Culianu. Not only because Marsilio Ficino was roaming in the good old days, and the sense of that is still, I guess, physically present there. Villa di Corliano, not far from Pisa, a haven, kind of piece of haven. Now, if there are questions or points that you would like to make, please. Katalin Stoika.
Well, first of all, congratulations. I'm a sociologist. I don't get to read too often, novels and stuff. Like you, I knew of Culianu when I was a grad student in the U.S. I knew who he was, but then an American friend of mine told me, "Oh, you should read this book by Ted Anton," and I got fascinated. But obviously, I'm in a different field and stuff. So yeah, congratulations, and sort of, I was fascinated by it, and some of your depictions are so vivid, like the episode at Varatek when Culianu is with his cousin. But then again, with the two friends who are reading the Aaron's, when I'm not gonna eat pizza or drink beer for like the next few weeks because pizza, you described it, it was so terrible with beer. And one of the things that I really appreciated was that I think you brought to the light some of the less discussed and more simplistic, down-to-earth theories of why he was assassinated and very down-to-earth. And one thing that I liked in particular is not you, but Aaron says that, well, probably Culianu thought he was a bigger deal, through his criticism of the new government in power. Probably he thought he was a bigger deal than he actually was.
That's one of the theories, right?
Yes,
But that was,
Yeah.
But then again, probably you get this question a lot.
This is a way of.
Who do you think killed him? This is
Well, I mean, today we were discussing this again, and Sorin was telling me that there's a strong belief now that that the order actually came from here, from the Securitate, and that it might have been somebody sent especially from here, maybe somebody working for the airline, for Tarom, that maybe even just went, did his job and came back. But I don't have the elements to have a solid theory myself. I thought that theory was attractive, the theory that everything happened in the diaspora. So Culianu writing and people reading him, but over there, and the people reading him over there thinking that he was actually a threat for Romania, but nobody in Romania reading him. So not really a threat. So kind of like a really sad and tragic farce that happened in the diaspora. But who knows?
But the thing is, if you talk about this, pushing aside, the fictional versions of that episode, if you go down to earth and we try to document the actions, the persons involved, actually, at various moments of this reconstruction, in some areas, and of course, his sister, Teresa Culianu Petrescu, of course, she managed to put together all these elements, knowing the full dimension of things that others do not know, cannot know. I mean, she knew, for instance, that while a student at the University of Bucharest, he had crossed paths with people that later emerged in the contemporary history of Romania. For instance, people such as Gelu Voican Voiculescu, for instance, who probably was the person who actually ordered. Because I'll give you one thing that I usually do not discuss, but there was Culianu was attracted to esotericism and occultism since a very young age. This was in many ways a family tradition, which in many ways is also a kind of normal tradition in the family of scientists. Yeah, because these people, chemists, physicists, astronomers, mathematicians, are also somehow tempted or excited or attracted, or it is how shall I put it? It is almost a professional hazard. That is one thing, but that something that did not appear I didn't have time to actually focus on this, and I will one day, hopefully, is the fact that what was the science that was fascinating the Culianu family and everybody for that matter from the late 80s into the interwar period. It was a science in which the occult, the esoteric was entering big time. It was a kind of revival of theories that had last been formulated before the Enlightenment and even before Cartesianism had been brushed aside for centuries, are now re-emerging on what basis? On the basis of precisely new physics. Because I have to celebrate these days at the moment, I mean, to write something celebratory for 35 years of Waldorf schools in Romania and of anthroposophy. And of course, my interest in Steiner before 1989 was almost completely related to his connection to the new science of the late 1880s. Not so much to Goethe and the Woodpflanze and all these things, wonderful stuff, of course, fascinating. It was more interesting in the fact that there was an impact of the new sciences just before physics got into all these things in indeterminacy and all these things towards the 1920s, 30s. This trend existed from before, and the epoch of Mach, Avenarius, and all these people, right, were kind of unorthodox physicists who are looking at the world in different ways. Now, this was enhancing actually and relaunching esotericism and occultism. So Culianu, in many ways, was following a kind of family tradition in which they were all more or less raised. This was further enhanced by his summers at Varatic and the connection to, and the fact that he was, so they were raised by a nun, and so on. And so I don't find it so bizarre that somebody, looking into the sciences, in fact, is discovering that. We only know, for instance, we know better, where, became more popular, the New Age version of that, which is in fact a kind of popular, vulgar, rewriting of all those things. And New Age of the 1970s, 80s gave a new impetus to esoteric occultist ideas and practices from before. And Romania was one of those places beyond the Iron Curtain where such things were flourishing. As I told you, I remember the time when since I could read theoretical stuff in physics and astronomy, I was interested in this, I would be approached by physicists who are desperate to understand Fritjof Capra or Castaneda and things of the sort, and were approaching me because the guys trained exclusively in philology and literary theory didn't understand what the story was about, so they could not relate to the science part of that. Well, Culianu is in many ways a result of that time. So if you will look at his fiction, if we look obvious, some people who were writing literary theory and literary history here in Romania placed him into, because they didn't know the science part of this. They connected it to the generic thing of fantastic literature or of fantasy. This is not the case, because Eliade himself was rather close to that, but Culianu was much closer because he had, how shall I say, yeah, he had a gift for the sciences. And in the family, this was. So the kind of esotericism, occultism was that. And that was the time when probably people around him, and I will close this esoteric occultist part of it, he, for instance, would visit George Balan, the musicologist, who later became a guru of German anthroposophists when he emigrated, who at some point retired to Sinaia. And since today there was this launch of a new book about the Păltiniș school, the school of Păltiniș, we discussed with there was also a smaller Sinaia school from Sinaia, or of Sinaia, where the teacher was George Balan, and where people as different as Ioan Petru Culianu, Andrei Pleșu, Leonida Pope, originally a priest, then an anthroposophist, the one who brought from Germany, who brought anthroposophy and Waldorf schools from there. So in the 70s and 80s, this was a rather, how shall I say, common experience of the smart, of course, who could relate to that. And some of that smartness turned sour in Romania, was, I guess, used by the secret services, not so secret services, and then I think could have contributed to this. So I link this. There are episodes that are remembered by Andrei Pleșu, for instance, of their common experience with Culianu, Leonida, and others in Sinaia, in George Balan's house, where the trade was very simple. You translate this from German into Romanian for distribution to people who couldn't read German, and you get to read that, you see. So the thing was, and Andrei Pleșu reminds us of this, Culianu would go immediately to one corner, would say, well, what is there to be translated? Would do it in no time, put the thing there, and then get the prize. Andrei was slow looking out the window and said, I never managed to finish my ratio or my quota, and I was getting less books than that. So I'm saying all this in order to remind people, even from Romania, that there was such a time. Now, we are reminded there was such a time by the recent elections with this eccentric guy who came up with a new age and things like that, esotericists. And so they are not so original, so new, so recently imported. So there is a kind of course, as in his generation, he was a latecomer to this. But still, there was a moment where the threshold between, where the liminal space between fantasy, science, occultism, and as it turns out in Culianu's case, murder. And in all, of course, you have all the previous esotericisms that had been associated with chauvinistic nationalism, metaphysical nationalism of the 1920s. That is, things are not that mysterious. Unfortunately, as always, our secret services didn't manage to sort this out. So we remain with the enigma and we remain with this. That is a consolation that we have things to read and to dream about. And I'm grateful to you for this, Pablo. Yeah, because this is a way of reminding ourselves that there is something higher and deeper than the worlds we live in, and who knows? Maybe this is one way of getting closer to that. So, once again, you want to say something? Go ahead. Stereo Lambro.
Writing this novel, have you paid any attention to Eliades' writings? Master of
Yes.
Culianu?
When I was writing the novel, no. I started reading Eliade after. So while I was writing the novel, I also didn't look at, I didn't want to do a lot of actual sort of serious research on the milieu. I didn't read any bibliography about Culianu. I only read his work, and I didn't read any of the other novels about Culianu because I didn't want to. I didn't want that to interfere.
You did well, I think.
So Eliade is. I mean, I had read the Eternal Return. I mean, that long time before, but I went back to Eliade much way after, and especially I started reading his fiction that I had never read.
I'm asking about it.
Right. Yes. And actually, it's his fiction is being published in Italian now. The second volume has just come out. It's a 7-page volume of his collected fiction. So it's having a moment now in Italy. The Eliade as a fiction writer. Yes.
Well, again, probably not. How shall I say, by accident, because Italy has two things that have been lost elsewhere, are being rediscovered in ways that I do not recognize. But in any case, in Italy, there has been a persistence, through the persistence of fascism, not far from the surface of general culture and the public discourse, there was a persistence of esotericism, occultism, all that. And this was the resonance box for everything that Eliade was. And that is immediately noted in it's just one looks at the collections at various publishing houses. Bietti is one of them, just one of them. But the most mainstream publishing houses have very strong series of this kind. So it's a continuous presence of a reference which was central for the young Eliade in his own formation when going to Italy and learning, and then from there going to India, when learning, directly attending classes, seeing all these big shots. So, I mean, people like Evola were people like that, they were basic knowledge and somehow this has somehow survived deep underneath, connected with sometimes rebranded as forms of perennialism, of transhistorical, of Oriental studies. And I was, as some people know, very close with a friend of and protector of Culianu in Italy, Grazia Marchiano, and Elimire Zolla, her husband. They were all in this movement. They were I think it is because of that Italians are more, how shall I say, akin and also more open to this kind of their culture, even including popular culture, but high academic humanistic culture, obviously, was not totally rationalized, purged of all these elements. And thus, Eliade speaks to them. And this is why Culianu speaks to them in ways in which we speak to other cultures. We stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Pablo Maurette.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.